Okay, next is the CCF.
Thank you. So my name is Janani Shanmuganathan, and I am counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and my questions are for Commissioner Lucki. So earlier today, when Commission Counsel was asking you questions, he brought up discussions with federal ministers about RCMP taking over the Ottawa Police Service, and you responded and said, that was an issue that you were asked about often, and that you had to explain that the RCMP was not the police of jurisdiction in Ottawa. You recall that?
Yes, but I think I'd have to correct myself. It wasn't often. It was brought up a couple of times.
Sure, and the response was, the RCMP is not the police of jurisdiction in Ottawa.
And nor do we have any jurisdiction in Ontario for that type of policing.
Okay, so I want to just talk a little bit about this notion of jurisdiction, okay? So I want to take you to the RCMP Act, and Mr. Registrar, that's CCF 6029. And if I can ask to be taken to page 20, please. You could just scroll down and just stop there. Great. So Section 18 of the RCMP Act, 18A specifically, sets out the duties of peace officers, the duties of RCMP officers. And what 18A says is, it is the duty of members who are peace officers subject to the orders of the Commissioner, A, to perform all duties that are assigned to peace officers in relation to the preservation of the peace, the prevention of crime, and of offenses against the laws of Canada. And it goes on to say, and the laws enforced in any province in which they may be employed, and the apprehension of criminals and offenders and others who may be lawfully taken into custody. So you'll agree that this is the provision that sets out sort of the powers of RCMP officers. Yes?
Yes.
And, where it says the prevention of crime and of offenses against the laws of Canada, that's part of the federal policing mandate of enforcing federal statutes. You'll agree?
Not necessarily, because anybody can enforce federal statutes. It's not just a federal law enforcement. Provincial and municipal police services can also enforce federal statutes, like the CDSA, the Drugs and Substance Act, for example.
Okay, so you'll agree, though, that RCMP officers have the power to enforce the criminal code, for instance?
Yes.
Right? And they always have the power to enforce the criminal code. It's just part of what they're allowed to do.
Yes.
Right? They don't need to be sort of the local police in a jurisdiction. This is a power that they always have.
Yes.
Right? And there's nothing in the criminal code, for example, that says an RCMP officer can't enforce the criminal code in one particular place. They can enforce it anywhere in Canada.
I'm not sure where you're going with this, but I think, in fact, like, for instance, anybody can enforce if you find somebody committing under the criminal code. So you don't even have to be a police officer. But there is a jurisdiction where, obviously, if police and public safety is involved and you are standing there, you have to act on that. Any police officer has to act on that. But
including RCMP officers?
Yes, including RCMP officers.
Okay, so just to use sort of a bit of a silly example, if we have an RCMP officer that's standing on Wellington Street in Ottawa and they see somebody committing an offense under the criminal code, they don't need to call up Ottawa Police Service to arrest the person. They can go and arrest the person themselves.
Yes.
Right? Okay. And now we've heard a lot about, the appointment of special constables under Section 53 of the Police Services Act.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what that does, it gives an RCMP officer who's appointed a special constable the powers to enforce provincial and municipal authorities that, Ottawa Police Service would be allowed to do.
Yes.
And this would be in addition to the power to enforce the criminal code, which they always have.
Yes.
All right. And now, it's fair to say that, during these protests, criminal code offenses were being violated. You'll agree with that?
There were some, yes.
Some. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there was an injunction that was granted in Ottawa in relation to several City of Ottawa bylaws, which include, open air bylaws, fireworks bylaws, noise bylaws. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
All right. And you'll agree, of course, that an injunction is a court order.
Yes.
And Section 127 of the Criminal Code makes it a criminal offense to breach a court order. You'll agree?
Well, with injunctions, though, usually there has to be an enforcement order attached to the injunction that we would allow police to enforce the injunction. So I don't know if there was any enforcement order attached to that.
Okay, so if I was to say to you, hypothetically, if there was an enforcement order that's attached, a police officer could arrest somebody for breaching a court order, in this case, an injunction. I'm
not sure. I'm not a lawyer. I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
So you don't know whether a police officer is allowed to, under Section 127, to arrest someone if they're violating a court order?
No, you weren't asking that. You were asking the RCMP in Ottawa, and it's not our jurisdiction. So I would have to refer to my legal people to ask that question. And we do that all the time when it comes to enforcement.
Okay, so if it fell within the ambit of Section 127, which speaks to breaching a court order, an RCMP officer could arrest a person for that, right?
But I'm not sure how the injunction was obtained, if it falls under the criminal code and if it's an actual court order that's breachable. I'd have to do a little bit more research. Sorry.
Sure. Okay. So leaving aside, the research you say you need to do, if I was to put to you, and I can bring up Section 127 if that would assist, Mr. Registrar, that is CCF 6028. And it's page 230. So we see over there, 127 says, everyone who without lawful excuse disobeys a lawful order made by a court of justice or by a person or body of persons authorized by any act to make or give the order other than an order for the payment of money is unless, and it talks about the punishment. So you'd agree, though, that an RCMP officer who has the ability to enforce the criminal code and always has this ability could arrest somebody under Section 127 for violating 127.
But you were referring to the injunction, and I don't know if an injunction falls under the disobeying or an order of the court.
That's fine, but my question now is whether an RCMP officer, could arrest someone for contravening Section 127 of the code.
In all likelihood, yes.
All right. So my question to you, or I put to you that, there's nothing that legally prevented you from deploying RCMP officers to enforce the criminal code in Ottawa.
But we aren't the police of jurisdiction in Ottawa. And so it is, I don't know if it's a common law or what authority it is. It would be like bringing Ottawa Police Service and then putting them in downtown Toronto and saying, we're just going to start policing. Everybody, there's a jurisdiction and there's a police of jurisdiction for a reason. And so if I find somebody committing a criminal code offense and I see them committing and it's under the powers of arrest that I can, in fact, arrest, I can arrest. But for the purpose of this exercise, we would not simply walk in and decide that we were the police of jurisdiction. Could you imagine the mayhem that would lead to if every police just arrived and said, we're going to be the police of jurisdiction today?
So I just want to sort of clarify, there may be a difference between, say, tradition and respecting the authority of local police and not intruding on them or entrenching on them. But you'll agree that there's nothing that legally prevented you from sending RCMP officers to enforce the things that they're always allowed to do, which is the criminal code.
Yes, and we weren't objecting to assisting in that regard. So that's why I'm not understanding your questions.
All right, those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next is the